Welcome to this presentation of Colonel William Wells Hollister and the extraordinary contributions he made to Santa Barbara, including ownership of the first hotel designed to attract tourists to our city. My name is George Sampanis, and I will be your host as we open a window into Santa Barbara's past. William Wells Hollister was born near Hanover, Ohio in 1818 to Colonel John Hollister and Felina Hubbard. After his father died, he and his brothers ran the family farm, their iron foundry, and their mercantile store until 1852. Hollister adopted his father's nickname, Colonel, a ceremonial name, for he was never in the military. There are two conflicting accounts of his first trip to California. The first has him selling the farm and using the proceeds to buy about 300 head of cattle, which he drove across the American plains to California to feed gold miners. Making a large profit, he returned to Ohio and planned for a second trip west, this time with a herd of sheep. The second version has him coming west on a wagon train to the gold fields of California and quickly realizing that it was easier to make money by selling provisions instead of panning for gold. He returned to Ohio to plan another trip west, with his interest in raising sheep seeing more potential in that than in searching for gold. He borrowed money from his sister Lucy Brown and purchased 5,000 head of sheep. Either way, the plan was to supply mutton, lamb meat, and wool to the gold miners. He, his brother Joe, and their sister Lucy Brown formed a wagon train made up of 50 men, 4 women, and 11 wagons, and headed west with the herd of sheep now numbering 6,000. Leaving Hanover, Ohio in 1854, by the time they reached the Utah desert, the herd had been reduced drastically by bad water, fire, blizzards, Indians, and wild animals down to 2,000 head. To avoid winter snows of the Sierra Nevada, the party took a southern route from Salt Lake City through New Mexico and Arizona. After crossing the Mojave, it was further cut in half to 1,000 head when he arrived 12 miles west of Santa Barbara at the Dos Pueblos Ranch, where he wintered his stock. He loved the area and vowed he would return someday, buy the property, and there build his home. In the spring, the herd was bolstered by sheep born at the winter camp, and when he reached his destination, the San Justo Ranch in what is San Benito County, he had a herd of 2,000 sheep. He reinvested his profits buying more sheep and purchasing several ranches consisting of thousands of acres. Over the next decade, he became quite wealthy and later partnered with Thomas Dibley on more land ventures, eventually acquiring over 165,000 acres in Santa Barbara County alone. Pictured here, years later, is an 1885 photograph of a picnic at Hollister's Glen Annie. In the foreground is the Colonel, his wife Annie, and to his left, his sister, Auntie Brown. In this vintage photograph, Annie Hollister is pictured under the parasol and W.W. is standing to her left. The huge edifice behind them is their home, Glen Annie. Quoting the website Cardis, Letters from Home, He was one of the most well-respected ranchers of the United States, owned several magnificent ranchos, much of the land located along the Santa Barbara coastline. He planted tens of thousands of acres of oranges, dates, and English walnuts in groves, forever changing the landscape not only of Santa Barbara County, but the entire state of California. Eventually, he owned the magnificent Arlington Hotel and much of the city. He owned a bank, and an entire city in Central California is named for him. He was an elder statesman, he was a man of creative imagination and innovation, and he had great influence in Santa Barbara County." End quote. In the winter of 1885, Charles Nordhoff, a writer for Harper's Weekly magazine and a respected author, visited California. He went back east and wrote a series of articles in a bestseller book, California for Health, Pleasure, and Residence, a book for travelers and settlers. In his writings, he stated, of all the great places in California, Santa Barbara is the pleasantest of all, and because of its climate and the abundance of medicinal hot and cold springs, it was the world's most ideal health resort. The next winter, a tide of immigration consisting of tourists and those in need of a healthy climate changed the sleepy town of Santa Barbara forever. Did you know the city of Ojai was named for him? For 43 years, 1874 until 1917, the city of Ojai was named Nordhoff. Then, heading up to and during World War I, American sentiment became increasingly anti-German. Across the United States, German and German-sounding place names were changed. As part of this trend, Nordhoff was renamed Ojai in 1917. The high school and the 4,425-foot peak that forms a backdrop for the town both retain his name. Meanwhile, back to Santa Barbara, several of Santa Barbara's leading citizens formed a stock company to explore building a world-class hotel to meet this growing need. Hollister was the chairman. He soon became the sole owner of the company. Because Nordhoff had described the waterfront as being damp and the best climate being away from the beach, Hollister insisted that it be built away from the beachfront. He hired Peter Barber, architect and later mayor of Santa Barbara, to design the hotel in the late Victorian style. Prior to that time, there were several smaller hotels in Santa Barbara, but they were more like boarding houses, such as the St. Charles Hotel pictured here. The Arlington was the city's first hotel designed and oriented to the tourist. In 1875, the magnificent Arlington Hotel was constructed at a cost of $200,000. It opened the next year, 1876, as a luxurious, instantly famous, world-class hotel. This photograph was taken shortly after the hotel was completed, as evidenced by the absence of any landscaping. The hotel sat on a block bordered by State, Victoria, Chapala, and Sola Streets, where the Arlington Theater and several retail stores are today. The hotel faced State Street, which is in the foreground of this photograph. The hotel was 3 stories high, L-shaped, and luxuriously furnished with the finest draperies, carpeting, and furniture that money could buy. The plumbing was state-of-the-art, with running water in each of the 90 guest rooms, and each room had a marble fireplace and speaking tubes to allow the guests to call and communicate with the front desk. There were several billiard rooms, including a private one for the ladies. There were rooms for reading, smoking, and a separate dining room for children. The room ceilings were 15 feet high, and the exterior porch was 16 feet wide, providing the guests with over 600 feet of promenade space, and during inclement weather, protecting the guests from the elements. The Arlington immediately became the entertainment and social center of the city, extending the business district downtown by several blocks, and it was instrumental in bringing the street railway to Santa Barbara. These two vintage postcards show some of the mature landscaping that surrounded the hotel. In the bottom postcard, it displays what is purported to be the world's largest rose bush. The grounds included a menagerie and a deer park, complete with buck, doe, and fawn. As I mentioned earlier, the Arlington was the catalyst for establishing the city's first streetcar. The first car was mule-driven. The track ran from the hotel down to the base of Stearns Wharf. At the end of each line was a turntable where the conductor would unhitch the mule and manually turn the car around, rehitch the mule, and then continue his route back. The pull up State Street was quite difficult, and often a thoughtful Santa Barbara conductor would give the hard-working animal a well-deserved ride on the rear platform for the trip down State Street. This postcard view shows another thoughtful conductor giving his animal a restful ride in Denver. The car ran on a narrow-gauge track. It was soon determined that it was too much of a burden for one mule to pull a car, so a second mule was added. There were no passing tracks, and as I mentioned before, there were turntables at each end of the line. The car operated from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. In it were two benches capable of accommodating 12 passengers. The fare was 5 cents. After 20 years on the job, a retirement party was held for the original mule. In 1877, after a San Francisco bank failed, a run on the bank here was diverted when W. Hollister, then a bank officer, stood by the bank entrance, guaranteeing each depositor with his own personal funds. The stock certificate for 5 shares to O.D. Metcalf is dated 1881. Notice it is signed by Amasa Lincoln on the bottom left and by W. Hollister, bottom right. Some of you might recognize the name Larco. Well, Sebastian Larco was a local fisherman who sold his fish in a small building at 214 State Street. This building was moved in the 1980s to Cabrillo Boulevard, where it serves today as the Santa Barbara Visitor Center. He told the following story to Walker Tompkins of an 1884 streetcar incident. Our story opens with the streetcar mule team being frightened by some disturbance near the intersection of State and Gutierrez Streets. The animals took flight, dragging the southbound car to the end of the line where it jumped the track, continuing in the direction of the pier. The driver disembarked when his car began rumbling over the splintered plank decking of the wharf. Sightseers scrambled out of the way as they saw the streetcar approaching. The team was just beginning to pick up speed when they neared the warehouse at the seaward end of the wharf. Longshoremen unloading lumber boats sprinted out of the way as the mules raced to the pierhead and vaulted the big 12 by 12 beams. The streetcar bounced over the barrier behind the team and hurtled downward to hit the sea with a huge splash. The iron wheels and supporting undercarriage plummeted to the bottom, but the car itself floated like a feather, still hitched to the mules. Not pausing in their flight, the mules started swimming towards Santa Cruz Island, 25 miles away, towing the truckless streetcar behind them. The driver-conductor managed to command a fishing boat which succeeded in overtaking the maritime mules when they ran out of steam a quarter of a mile offshore. Mules and car were taken in tow. The submerged truck was later hoisted up to the wharf's decking and returned to its rightful place under the car, and within a week, the seagoing streetcar was back in service on State Street, ending one of the most bizarre incidents in the city's history. Let's get back to the hotel and gaze upon all the activity around the hotel as captured in this later photograph. If you happen to be at the former site of the hotel, in front of the Arlington Theater, you'll notice a historical marker there designating the spot as the starting point of the northbound stage. There were two routes north, one over San Marcos Pass and the other through Gaviota Pass. This stage is about to depart via the San Marcos Pass. We can tell that by counting the number of horses pulling the coach. If it were traveling via Gaviota, 4 horses would do the job. Travel via San Marcos Pass required 6 horses to traverse the steeper grade. A few steps down State Street, at the intersection with Anapamu, is the Santa Barbara College, as shown in this 1870 photograph. The college was not a college as we know today. It was a co-ed, private boarding school for high school-age students. After several years, the college failed, and Hollister, who was the primary financier, converted it into the Elwood Hotel. The Elwood was renamed the San Marcos Hotel and is pictured here along with the high steeple of the Presbyterian Church. The San Marcos became Hollister's second hotel, which leads me into the story of separating the sheep from the goats. Tied up at the wharf is the freighter State of California, discharging a cargo of lumber at Stearns Wharf. And here the passenger steamer, the Santa Rosa, is approaching our city, a regular stop on her run between San Francisco and San Diego. Here, she is secured to the wharf, ready to discharge her passengers. At the foot of the gangplank, standing inconspicuously beside a pile of lumber, is a tall man in a stovepipe hat. He is there to separate the sheep from the goats. The affluent and first-class cabin passengers, the sheep, will be sent to the ultra-deluxe Arlington, while the sailors, second-class, and deck passengers, the goats, will be assigned to the less opulent San Marcos Hotel. The man in the hat is the owner of both hotels, Colonel Hollister. Only his porters can read the tiny hand gestures as he separates the clients for his 2 hotels. The Arlington was very successful, and after 3 years, they opened a major annex, adding 50 new guest suites, shown on the left side of this postcard. And here is a closer look at the annex. As a token to their success, no pun intended, this beautifully engraved 1895 coin advertises the hotel as a first-class winter and summer resort. One has to be impressed when looking at the celebrities that visited the hotel, which included royalty, presidents, governors, senators, diplomats, entertainers, and many of the world's rich and famous. Among the famous that stayed at the hotel were Princess Louise, the daughter of Queen Victoria, and her husband, the Governor General of Canada. Also, King David Kalakaua, the last king of Hawaii, and Presidents Harrison, McKinley, and Roosevelt. Early in December of 1882, Colonel Hollister received word that the Princess Louise and her husband, the Marquis of Lorne and General Governor of Canada, were planning a visit to Santa Barbara later in the month. Colonel Hollister sent his wife Annie to San Francisco to buy carpeting, draperies, tapestries, and exquisite furniture. I am just amazed how Annie was able to travel to San Francisco by ship, shop for all of these items specifically designed for the royal couple, the colors of royalty and the materials of royalty. She was able to find them in stock, have them packaged and delivered to the ship, sail back to Santa Barbara, and have them installed in less than 3 weeks. The entire second floor was redecorated with 16 front-facing rooms reserved for the royal couple and their entourage. On Christmas Eve, all Santa Barbara had gathered at Stearns Wharf to greet the royal princess. Hollister gave Her Highness his arm and conducted her to the waiting carriages and rushed her off to the Arlington Hotel. For a week, the town outdid itself paying homage to the princess and her entourage. The couple, looking from their upstairs balcony, were entertained by fiestas, rodeos, calf roping, bronco busting, greased pig chases, and greased flagpole climbing, all of which thrilled and pleased the royal couple to no end. In addition, she was honored by the Padres of the mission, who opened the gates of the sacred gardens to the princess. It was the first time in history that a woman had ever entered the gardens. Another royal visitor to the Arlington was King Kalakaua of Hawaii. The king visited Santa Barbara many times. During his visits of 1889 and 1890, he spent several weeks here. He was a famed sportsman and a likable guy popular with everybody in town. Often, local citizens would invite him to their homes for dinner, and the Merry Monarch, as he was called, joyfully accepted and was one of the guys. A friend of his created quite a scandal in town when he rode his horse into the bar of the Arlington Hotel. Well, David had a passion for music, dancing, partying, the finest food and drink, and gambling. At his last prolonged fling at the Arlington, he lost very heavily at poker. He departed for San Francisco, planning to head home. Unfortunately, all his merriment did him in. Sadly, he never made it home alive. He fell ill and died suddenly of a kidney ailment. The remains of the last king of Hawaii were returned home to Honolulu for burial. In 1889, Santa Barbara received her visit by a president of the United States, Benjamin Harrison. A magnificent floral parade on State Street, decorated with flower garlands and 4 huge arches like the one pictured here, were placed at key intersections. The president and his wife were most grateful for the pompous reception rivaling Princess Louisa's visit. Mrs. Harrison was further honored by becoming the second woman to enter the sacred gardens at the mission. In 1901, William McKinley paid a visit to Santa Barbara. On the left, he is addressing the crowd at the Arlington Hotel, and on the right, he's pictured at the mission. The New York Times issue of May 11, 1901, reporting on the president's visit, stated that he was overwhelmed by the flowers, warm greetings, and reception received, and expressed his earnest gratitude. An unusual incident occurred during his visit. The residence of the chief of the fire brigade caught fire. The fire chief, who was on the street awaiting the coming of the president, was informed that his house was in flames. "Let it burn. I can build another house, but I may never have another opportunity to see the President of the United States." And he stoically remained while his house burned to the ground. "I saw the President," he replied, when informed that his house was lost. Okay, let's go inside for a look at the lobby, which was graced by the visit of President Theodore Roosevelt in 1903. On the right, he's pictured at the mission, his last stop before boarding the train at Victoria Station. Reaching the corner of Pedregosa and Laguna, one of his outriders, Harry Hollister, pointed out his mother to the president as she was viewing the entourage from a nearby porch. The woman, Annie Hollister, was the widow of the colonel and the mother of another son, Stanley, who was wounded as he stood beside the future president on San Juan Hill. Stanley later succumbed to typhoid fever, which he had contracted in Cuba during the war. The president ordered an abrupt stop, jumped onto the street, and ran to the porch. There he told Annie how proud he was to serve with her son and what a fine man and brave soldier he was. Having lost critical moments in his strict schedule, the cavalcade galloped the rest of the way to Victoria Station. A few steps away from the lobby, we enter the dining room. Now picture yourself being there with me on Thursday, November 30th, 1876, Thanksgiving Day. The Thanksgiving dinner menu includes items that I am about to order. I think for starters, I'll order the green turtle soup, some beef tongue, ping wing duck with jelly, and for an entree, I think I'll have the baked brains alla Italian. Now for something much more appealing, we skip down to the dessert section to see Santa Barbara almonds and walnuts. They were grown at the Glenannie property in Goleta, as were several of the vegetables on the menu. This is a copy of the wine list that accompanied the Thanksgiving dinner menu of 1876. Notice the prices are for a pint or a quart, not for a glass. Disaster struck the Arlington on August 15, 1909, as the main building caught fire. The on-duty clerk directed his bellboys to evacuate the dining room, which had 150 or so guests, and to go upstairs to each of the 90 guest rooms to make sure that nobody was there. In the meantime, he ran to the corner of State and Victoria Streets where the fire alarm box was located. Unfortunately, when he got there, the box was rusted shut. In the time it took him to get a hammer, break the box open, and sound the alarm, precious minutes were lost. When the firemen arrived, they did their best to save the main building, but they soon concentrated their efforts on the annex and saved that structure. The main building was doomed and gone forever. There were many acts of heroism that day, and local citizens opened their homes and their hearts, providing food, shelter, clothing, and more to the bewildered guests. The ruins burned through the night. After the fire, excitement centered on the, quote, fireproof safe, end quote. Back then, manufacturers made claim that their product was fireproof, only to find the content globbed in a big lump of metal after a fire. The Arlington safe held thousands in deposits of jewelry and cash. When the embers cooled, the safe was dragged out with cables to the current location of the Arlington Theater box office and left there to cool for 5 days. On day 6, a large crowd gathered in suspense to watch the opening. Much to the delight of the onlookers, the door opened with little difficulty and the contents were intact to the last penny, ending the heartbreaking week on a positive note. Like the legendary Phoenix, the Arlington, after an expenditure of $1.5 million, rose from the ashes. It reopened for business in February 1911, a mere 14 months after the fire. It was the fastest constructed building in the city's history. Arthur B. Benton, a Los Angeles architect, designed the hotel in the beautiful Mission Revival style. There were several innovative features, including an underground garage to accommodate the new mode of transportation, the automobile. I'll expand on this a little later. The annex was given a new facade in the Mission style and blended perfectly with the new building. In the center of this postcard, note the 2 Mission towers. Inside the largest tower to the right, Benton ingeniously hid a 50,000-gallon water tank. The new Arlington, built entirely of steel, brick, and concrete, would never burn again. The hotel was featured in several movies produced by the Flying Ace Studios, which were located in Santa Barbara. In this photograph, the beautiful silent movie superstar actress Mary Miles Minter plays the part of a nurse, and the hotel is portrayed as a hospital. As I mentioned earlier, the garage was one of the innovative features of the hotel. In this view, you can see a new mode of travel, the automobile, exiting the hotel. In those days, very few roads were paved. Automobile travelers would be clothed in dust jackets, which went down to the ankles, a cap, and a set of goggles to protect them from dirt, dust, and mud. The guests, covered with road grime, could drive directly into the garage where they would be registered and be brought to their rooms to freshen up without being seen in their soiled clothes by others in the lobby. In this postcard view, the hotel is on the right, and guests dressed in the fashion of the day are seated watching 2 gentlemen golfing. In the center, a tennis match is in process, making for a beautiful setting in the middle of the city. But the glory days for the hotel were numbered. On the morning of June 29, 1925, at 6:43 a.m., disaster struck Santa Barbara. In an ironic twist, the 50,000-gallon water tank, designed to save the hotel from fire, was the cause of death to two well-known persons. Located in the tower below the water tank were the hotel's elegant tower suites, the finest accommodations the Arlington had to offer. In just a few seconds, the water tank began to oscillate, broke loose, and collapsed onto the two most luxurious suites. On the previous evening, wanting nothing but the very best for his son, the wealthy Captain Allen Hancock had given up his suite to his only son Bertram. The captain had moved to a less opulent room down the hall, which he shared with his general foreman, Joe Chapman. "My son probably never awakened from his sleep," Captain Hancock was quoted in a Santa Barbara News Press article a week later on July 2nd. Bertram, the only son, was heir apparent to the vast Hancock fortune. The captain had asked him to join his business after graduating college 1 month earlier. Bertram was eager to show his father his business plan to start a major cattle operation in Santa Maria. First thing in the morning at 7:30, they would be heading there, but their plans were dashed by the deadly earthquake. Captain Allen Hancock was a man of many talents. He was a sea captain, an oilman, an explorer, a developer, a banker, an aviator, a scientist, a businessman, a farmer, and a railroad engineer. He was a musician and a philanthropist and a survivor, as the following account taken from Bertram's last drive, the Arlington Hotel tragedy, will attest, and I quote, "The moment the quake struck, G. Allen Hancock was preparing to take a bath and had just removed his pajama bottoms when he found himself suddenly thrown violently through the air. It all happened in a minute," he later related. "The crash of falling timbers and steel beams and the walls of the hotel made an indescribable inferno of sound which dazed me." End quote. In an incredible miracle, Joe Chapman had also been thrown out from the hotel by the quake, with Chapman falling 3 stories and landing perfectly safe and unharmed on the neatly trimmed lawn. Hancock landed on the lawn too, but in far worse condition. Stunned, bleeding, and seriously injured, Hancock, along with a dining room maid, managed to crawl out of the rubble where a bellboy ran to their aid. Hancock's shoulder had been pierced by a steel rod, barely missing his vital organs, and he suffered several broken rib bones, a fractured collarbone, and a concussion. But he was alive. As he lay on the manicured lawn of the hotel awaiting transport to the cottage hospital, he looked up to see the tower where his boy had been sleeping. It was gone. Years later, he told a friend, "In that frightful moment when the walls fell out and I was hurled through space, I caught a vivid, never-to-be-forgotten glimpse of my son's bed plunging downward in the roaring mass of twisted steel." Hancock fought with great energy, and he did recover and would prosper in incredible ways before dying just shy of his 90th birthday in 1965. In Santa Barbara to visit her daughter, her suite, 1 floor below Bertram's, was the wealthy 82-year-old widow of the former railroad president Charles E. Perkins. She was described as one of the most interesting women in Iowa, charming with a striking personality. She perished as the tank came crashing down. The next day, rescue workers found $200,000 worth of jewelry in the remains of her room. Equally remarkable as Captain Hancock's brush with death is the story of Mrs. Perkins' maid. As the first tremor struck, Mrs. Perkins screamed for her maid, who responded instantly. The door swung open outwardly, and the maid had to step back to open it. That saved her life, for just as the door swung open, the ceiling and floor collapsed, leaving the maid clutching the knob of the door, which now led to a drop into tons of debris, in which Miss Perkins was buried. In the end, however, it was falling business, not falling walls, that doomed the hotel. The hotel that started Santa Barbara on the road to becoming a world-class resort destination was no more. Many a Santa Barbara citizen shed a tear upon hearing the hotel would never be rebuilt. The Arlington was torn down, ending a 39-year reign as one of America's finest hotels.